looks right, right? Let's see. Are we getting somewhere? That's a great question. Only one way to find out. Only one way to find out. Good morning, good morning. Ha! Okay, I see that going. We love that. And here it is. Okay, perfect. All right, I see it working. We love it when it's working. Good morning, good morning. I'm just giving it an extra minute in case people want to hop on, because I know sometimes these are a little tricky. I hope everyone's doing well. We're having some nice weather this weekend, which has been really crazy because this has been some kind of March here in the Piedmont area, or at least in the Concord area for sure. I'm still not sure if March is done, so be wary of that. I know some people are setting out hummingbird feeders and everything already. They'll still be a little slow in the beginning and we'll probably have a lot of migrants passing through, but just keep an eye on that weather in case anything jumps back down into freezing temps. I would hate for hummingbird feeders to crack overnight from any of that colder weather as well too. So let me see. And it's 8:30. Honestly, I have a lot to talk about, so we're going to go ahead and just let it ride. Good morning. Thanks so much for joining me today. We're going to go ahead and just get started, right? Good morning, everyone. My name is Jolene. I'm a certified songbird feeding specialist with Wild Birds Unlimited of Concord. And today we are going to be talking about pollinators, a little bit outside of my wheelhouse as a certified songbird feeding specialist. But it never hurts to talk about what I do know or what I have learned with everyone as we're kind of moving forward with stuff. Plus, pollinators basically sustain everything at the base layer, right? And especially during nesting season, to make it a little weird, during nesting season for birds, caterpillars are a great resource of food as they are protein packed. But there's many benefits to our pollinators, and I want to talk about a lot of the ones that we have in the state. So we're going to go ahead and just jump right into it. If you guys have any questions during the presentation, I will do my best to answer them when I see them. If it is something I am not sure of, I will get back to you after the presentation. But with that, we're going to go ahead and get started there as well too. So before we jump into our pollinators and what they're doing, it's better to talk about what exactly the process is for pollination anyways, right? So we're going to jump way back into like early high school classes or whichever and just bare bones on that aspect, right? So for pollination, this is essentially the process of transferring pollen from the flower's anther, which holds all of the pollen, it's the male part of the flower, to the stigma, which is the female portion of the flower. This process is that pollination, and it's what allows for seed production. The seed is what contains that genetic information to create a new plant. So without that pollination process, it's not happening at all. No plants would ever be produced. We wouldn't be getting any fruit, and we would lose like a ton of food available to us currently. It's pollination is a process that's only successful if pollen is transferred from that in that same plant species, right? So this can happen when you when a pollinator transfers the pollen on the same flower, on a different flower of the same plant and that same individual, or if that pollen is carried over to a different flower on another plant. There are two primary vectors which are used for pollination. One is abiotic vectors, which include wind and water. A lot of our pine trees essentially will use wind as a vector, which is why we get so much pollen in the air at some points. So those are basically natural forms of pollination where they don't really require a lot of showy flowers to get the attention of wind or water because those are just essentially going to happen, right? But the main vector transmission that we're looking at is our biotic vectors, or those that we know as pollinators. This includes birds, mammals, and insects, and lots of different kinds, which is really cool because a lot of plants have actually evolved to attract specific pollinators. Some can be more generalist, while some are specialists and require a very specific insect or mammal or other species to pollinate those plants and get those seeds developed. So there are two primary reasons and two primary attractants that plants will use. First is the primary attractant. This includes nectar or pollen. This is what that animal or pollinator species needs in order to survive, whether that's just for nutrition, whether that is for their own young or anything like that. That's kind of what they need. But the secondary attractant is what the plant uses to attract the pollinator, right? So this includes things such as shape, color, and smell. And plants can get really creative too, which is super interesting, depending on what plants. Let's see. We don't have it here, but orchids can be really interesting. There is a orchid called a mirror orchid that essentially both smells and looks very similar to a specific species of female wasp, which actually attracts the male wasp to try and mate with it. And of course, it fails every single time. But in that process, it also pollinates the plant, which I find to be really interesting. There's some that smell horrible in order to attract flies or other pollinators. And of course, there are some that are beautiful and very sweet smelling and very interesting to attract other species as well too. So you can find lots of different varieties of flowers and plants, and they're super neat. And honestly, I don't think you could ever get tired learning about the different strategies used for pollination in those aspects as well too. So, one of our biggest pollinators here in North Carolina are our bees. If you did not know, there are actually 500 species of native bees in just North Carolina, right? There's primarily 5 different families, anything from mining bees, polyester bees, sweat bees, leafcutter, mason, and resin bees, and carpenter bees and bumblebees, right? I'm not talking about honeybees today. Those are not native species. They were introduced from different continents over to here. They are valued heavily in agriculture, but they're because of course they produce honey, and that is pretty good. Not gonna lie. But essentially, there can be a lot of concerns of them outcompeting native populations, or them potentially bringing certain pathogens that are not that our native species are not immune to, right? So there's a lot of concerns there as well. We do have 2 endangered or threatened species of bees here in North Carolina, the rusty patched bumblebee and the yellow banded bumblebee, both of which that are a little bit more endangered due to habitat loss or pesticide use. And again, those pathogens potentially spread from other managed bees, which can be like mites or different things like that as well. Now, what's really interesting about the many species of bees that we have, right, is when you picture a bee, you usually think of those that are like colony nesters and they're all moving in one kind of clump and they're all doing their own thing. They could be a little bit more aggressive, all that kind of stuff too. But most of our bees are actually solitary bees. So 98% of the native bee species in the US are solitary, which means they don't work in a hive setup. Basically, each one kind of does their own thing and leaves the other to it, which is really interesting, right? We're not really taught that much, or at least I wasn't when I was younger on that aspect. So these bees have a lifespan of 1 year, right? So it starts in like the spring and the summer, and then it ends by the next year. The adult phase for a lot of these bees is only 3 to 8 weeks. So essentially, once the temperatures start to hit 50 degrees Fahrenheit, which is what's happening right now, except it's all over the place. So if you haven't worked on your leaves or anything in your yard yet, I'd give it a little bit longer just to make sure that everybody's kind of out of those leaves and kind of doing what they're supposed to. But essentially what will happen, and I'm going to be using mason bees as a reference because these are the ones that I've kind of worked with or understood the best, right? So for mason bees in general, what happens is when the weather hits 50 degrees regularly, the males will erupt from their cocoons and they'll kind of linger around those spaces as they're waiting for the females to pop out a little bit later, right? So males don't last very long, and their priority is to mate with the female. Once they've done that, they've done their job. Usually they do that and then they pass away, right? So the females are actually the ones that are a little bit more interesting in this aspect as well, because once they have mated with the male, their main focus is on nest building. These females live independently, either nesting underground or in the hollows of plants or rock crevices. And what they'll do, and for example, with those mason bees, they'll sometimes go in like the hollow of plants or like those naturally made crevices. They are different from carpenter bees, just as a reminder. So let's say we've got like a hollow plant on this picture here, right? So the bee will go all the way to the back, and they'll go back and forth between gathering pollen and nectar, and they'll make a little pollen ball, and they'll nestle it all the way in the back here, and then they'll also lay a little egg on that pollen ball. And once they've done that, they'll actually wall off that little cell with mud, hence the whole mason name, which is really interesting. So once they've got that little cell, then they'll start making another one, another pollen ball, another egg, and then they'll kind of wall that off as well too. And they'll repeat this process until they finish building up the whole hollow of the plant, right? And what's interesting is they can control whether or not they are laying a male or female egg. So oftentimes the females are farther in the back while the males are up in the front. This is again for two reasons: so that the males are the first ones to come out, so that they can mate with the females on their way out, or in the event of any potential predators or things like that, the males are kind of hit first. Just to give the females a better chance at survival in some of those ways as well too, which is again super interesting. So once these eggs are laid, it does not take long for them to hatch. Sometimes like a little less than a day or a few days, where that egg will hatch. It'll start to work on that pollen ball and eat it. And once it grows and it becomes old enough, it will that larva will spin a cocoon, in which case it'll kind of take the rest of the summer to transform into an adult. And once it's done, it'll actually hibernate through the winter until it gets to next spring, where those temperatures turn into the 50s, and then they come out and they do the whole thing all over again, which is super. I find it really interesting. One thing as well is not every bee species kind of works at the same time. You might have some that are earlier pollinators, some that focus on like midsummer or later summer as well too. So you might see different bees during different sections, depending on who you have as well too. Leaf cutters will do a similar process, which is they just use leaves to kind of pack off those walls, which is again super cool. I love it. So the ones that you might think of colony nesters, or those that travel in those big hives, would also include bumblebees. And very similar to our solitary bees, these colonies do not survive more than 1 year, right? So the nest often starts out with a single queen who finds a nice sheltered place, whether that's kind of like your dry grass or anything like that, usually kind of sequestered away, where she will start creating wax-shaped cups that are filled with nectar and starts packing pollen around it, all that kind of stuff. And then once she's kind of got a good little section, she'll lay eggs on top of that, which they usually hatch in like 4 to 6 days. They'll spin cocoons after 2 to 3 weeks. And then usually the first ones that she produces are female workers who live for about 4 to 6 weeks. And they kind of go back and forth assisting in getting those materials, that pollen, that nectar, in order to kind of build the hive, or like that colony, right? So as the summer continues, those worker bees are staying really busy. The queen starts shifting over to producing males and also other queens. The new queens can eat up to 3 times the resources as some of the other bees have been. So it definitely takes a lot of work to sustain them. And by the end of the season, usually those males or those queens will kind of leave the nest, and the queens, the new ones, are the only ones that survive through that next year. That colony usually dies off in autumn naturally, and those new queens are the only survivors who hibernate again until that next spring. So it's a very cyclical pattern. It's really interesting to kind of see all that behavior as well too, if you ever get the chance, which is I don't know, it's fun. One thing I will mention about bees as well is they are probably one of our most effective pollinators, just because they do have those very fuzzy bodies. So as they're traveling from flower to flower in order to like get that pollen, which they need again for survival, things like that, they are very easily packing on that pollen, whether that's on hairs on the bottom of like their thorax, or if it's in like those little pollen balls on the side of their leg. Depends on the species. Super interesting to watch them go. So another type of pollinator includes our butterflies and moths. These guys are found in order Lepidoptera, and we have 175 butterfly species in North Carolina, and then 1,200 moth species as well. So it's definitely really interesting to see what we have more of. We do have some endangered species here in North Carolina. One is the St. Francis satyr, and then the other is the monarch butterfly. The St. Francis satyr is interesting because habitat loss occurred due to fire suppression. So oftentimes fire can occur in different habitats naturally, and that allows for a new growth forest, which supports very specific species. So when people try to suppress those fires from happening, that can adjust an overall habitat entirely. And also the local elimination of beavers in that area changed the habitat as well, which made it uninhabitable for these satyrs. One other thing that happened is these guys have many different colonies that we have found since first like checking their numbers, which has been great. But the original colony, or the population that they found in one area, was completely eradicated because of butterfly collection. So they completely removed one colony because they were so focused on that collection, but thankfully other colonies have been found since then. In cases of the monarch butterfly, we've also had a concern in their habitat or in their population decrease due to pesticide use, urbanization, and then different types of expanding like plantations and other industries. They're not taking into consideration their habitat as they're kind of moving forward with that as well. And we'll be talking more about them in just a second too, which is really interesting. In regards to the moth species, there's actually a lot about moths that we don't know because they are more of our nocturnal insects, which is a lot of fun. So in some cases, you might have some that are more of a pollinator than we expect. In other cases, they may not, because it's interesting with moths, as some of them turn into adults, they actually lose their mouth parts. So they're focusing on whatever resources they had bulked up on when they were caterpillars. And so some of them may not be focusing on pollination, but others may. So really interesting to see there. One pollinator that I will mention that we have here is the hummingbird clearwing moth, who pollinates during the day and the night. The reason that they're called this is because their movements are very similar to hummingbirds. They have a very rapid wing beat and they kind of move around in that same pattern. So they are super cool to observe if you ever get the chance as well too. So one thing that's very cool about a lot of butterflies and moths or things like that is that they focus heavily on host plants, right? So host plants are a specific type of plant essential to the life cycle of another organism. In this case, our butterflies and other pollinators. A very common example of this is our monarch butterflies and the milkweed, but I want to go into a little bit more detail on that because I find it super interesting, right? So many plants, not just the milkweed, often have different types of defenses in order to keep insects from eating them because, they're trying to survive as well too. But in these cases, certain insects and certain pollinators look at these plants and go, that looks pretty good. It's like, I want that, even though it's definitely probably not good for them, right? So monarch butterflies are interesting because the milkweed produces very toxic cardiac glycerides, so it's not good for things to be ingested. But the monarch was like, no problem, I can handle that, and produced an enzyme that would help store the toxin in the body. They also have aposematic coloration as well too. So when that toxin is stored in the body, it also makes the monarch very toxic as well. So in this case, it is very bright and colorful in a certain way to say, hey, don't eat me, you're not gonna like it. And over time, a lot of different animals and wildlife start to recognize that as well too. So, it's one of those things where they worked for this, right? Along with that, milkweed produces a very latex sap, okay? And it's basically the way it works is that if an insect tries to eat the milkweed, it produces this sap, which basically gets all over their mouth parts and basically kind of glues them shut. So that's not very helpful for survival. But of course, monarchs were like, no, we can figure this out. And they have a behavioral adaptation that the caterpillars eventually kind of instinctually knew, where essentially the caterpillars will start eating the leaf at the tip of the leaf, right? And the second they start to encounter any of that kind of sap, they'll turn around 2/3 on the way of the leaf and chew through this center midrib in order to stop the flow of the latex sap. And then, of course, they'll go back up and continue on their merry way. So basically, the caterpillars have figured out a way to handle all of the things that the milkweed is throwing at them, right? In exchange for this, right? So this is over like tons of years that the monarch has eventually figured out, okay, this plant, I figured out how to conquer this plant specifically. If they ever tried any of these things on a different type of plant, those things would not work. Pollinators have evolved to overcome the defenses of very specific species of plants, but in exchange for that, they have become dependent on that one plant species. So it is literally pretty much impossible for them to switch over to a new plant, especially in that younger larval stage of their life as well too, which I find crazy interesting. It's amazing how nature works like that. Now, when caterpillars turn into butterflies, of course, that can be a little bit different. You might have butterflies that will take nectar from almost any flower, others that stay specifically to that one plant, so it entirely just depends. And some plants are also host to multiple species as well, so you can have one oak tree that caters to hundreds of different species, depending on what they're going for as well. One other type of moth I will mention that we do have kind of more on the eastern side of the state is the yucca moth and its association with yucca plants. Essentially, this moth is one of the few that scientists have noticed pollinates the plant on purpose to ensure seed development. So they will make sure they go from place to place and make sure that the plant is pollinated, because what can happen is the yucca plant can sense when the moth lays too many eggs on it, and it will actually keep some of its flowers from blooming in order to kind of sustain itself for the next year. So in order to make sure that that doesn't happen, the yucca moth takes extra care to pollinate that plant on purpose, which is, again, these are just different behavioral adaptations that these different pollinators have used in order to continue working with that plant, which is so cool. I love it. I love it. Now, some of the things I will mention is we do have other pollinators that people may not like as much, but it's good to kind of notice them as well. Wasps are actually important for the population control of other insects. Oftentimes, their bodies are a little bit smoother, and it may be harder for them to kind of pollinate as well as like bees or butterflies or things like that in certain cases, but they are very beneficial for population control of other pest insects. Some wasps are parasitoids, which actually means they may lay eggs in other insects in order to continue their own life cycle. One that can commonly be known is a lot of people do not like tomato hornworm caterpillars because they can oftentimes eat the tomato plants, right? So certain wasps can actually lay eggs in that tomato hornworm, which kind of solves your problem and continues on with that life cycle as well too. A little morbid when you think too hard about it, but it's a very interesting process there. But wasps also drink nectar for supplemental nutrients, so they will kind of pass between flower to flower to do that as well. For beetles, pollen is a large part of their diet, so they are automatically switching from plant to plant and transferring the remaining pollen that kind of gets on them, which is really interesting as well. And with flies, they may not be as effective as some bees, but they've still got a lot of hairs on them as well too. But they are known for pollinating flowers that produce very bad odors as well. So there's definitely, and these may be plants that like don't look like as much. If I remember right, we have a native plant in my yard called a little brown jug, and it's just got the smallest little flower that can be pollinated by flies and other smaller insects as well. Yeah, Monica Willis said it's the craziest sight. Yeah, those caterpillars definitely have a rough time with the parasitoid wasp, but it's a very interesting process. It's something for sure. So just because they may not be as pretty or maybe a little bit concerning, there are many pollinators or many beneficial insects to our yards as well. So with that said, there have been a lot of concerns for our pollinators. There has been a lot of population decline that's been happening over the years due to habitat loss being one of the biggest things, whether that's from development, urbanization, intensive agriculture that just removes those plants and habitat, and also invasive species. The use of pesticides has been a big one. So one word I want to introduce to you guys today, if you haven't heard of it, is neonicotinoids or neonics. Essentially, this is a type of pesticide that is used on lots of different seeds before they even bloom or sprout. They can be toxic to pollinators, beneficial insects, and aquatic invertebrates. Essentially, this one has had a lot of widespread use, and there's been a lot of water solubility concerns. And essentially, how it works is it's absorbed systematically into the plant. So essentially, even though it's done while it's a seed, it can still be absorbed into that plant, and as it grows, it can become present in that pollen and that nectar. So, I said I have a spelling error there. So it's harmful to pollinators, and this is supposed to say months instead of moths, but months after the pesticide is initially applied. So even if it's done before bloom time, it can still cause a lot of issues, and it's used very heavily in a lot of different pesticides. So if you're ever looking for different types of plants, keep an eye on that. Double check with the people that you're working with whether these neonicotinoids have been used. It can be commonly applied to different seeds that are transferred over state lines as well too, for important reasons, but definitely not what we want to see. So definitely keep that in mind. And then also with the use of herbicides can also be a big concern. There's issues of residue contact, which can contaminate nesting material or nesting sites as well too, which can overall cause concerns for the life cycle of many of these pollinators. So, how can we help? I'm glad you asked. Even if you didn't, I'm here to tell you. Essentially, this can be done a few different ways. Certifying your yard with the National Wildlife Federation includes different things like whether this is done like in your yard or in a public setting or even on like your apartment balcony, right? This has different things that includes having food, water, shelter, places to raise young, and sustainable practices. Once you have these 5 checkpoints and you basically kind of check them off yourself, you can go with National Wildlife Federation and kind of certify your yard as one of these areas. 83% of land in the United States is privately owned. Outside of that, you've got areas that are maybe national parks or forests. But other than that, 83% is privately owned, which means if all of us are using basically having lawns and other things like that where we don't have a lot of habitat for our wildlife, it causes a lot of issues and often becomes a biological desert, right? So, and to clarify, these are all different things that you can utilize under like that certifying your yard thing that can kind of help benefit your pollinators. I'll also be talking about another thing on the slide in a second as well too. But essentially, one of the biggest things that you can do is actually reducing your lawn space. Lawns require heavy water use, and they often require a lot of fertilizers or pesticides or herbicides to kind of help keep them green and all that kind of stuff as well too. If it rains, there can often be a lot of runoff of these different types of things that are utilized in the yard, which can affect more than just the yard itself. So reducing your lawn and potentially incorporating some native plants is a great way to kind of help support some of your pollinators. Leaving the leaves is another one. And this doesn't have to be all over your yard. I know some people like to have it clean, and I totally understand that. But essentially, picking sections where you can leave those leaves can be super important because oftentimes many different types of caterpillar species will essentially turn into like chrysalis in those leaves. And it's not just caterpillars, it's many different types of pollinators and insects. And when those leaves fall, they're on the ground, right? So you have some that are stuck in the leaves, some that use the leaves as an insulation buffer when they enter the soil, and many different things. So when we're bagging those up too early and they haven't finished their life cycle, we're actually influencing those local populations as well. So essentially what you want to do is, I know the weather has been fantastic recently, but essentially you want to wait for the temperature to be 50 degrees consistently for a few weeks before removing those leaves in the spring. Give those pollinators a chance to finish their life cycle overall before you actually start to get in there and really enjoy cleaning up your yard. Other things that you can consider, amber outdoor LED lights actually attract less attention from bugs at night, including a lot of pest insects that you may be thinking of as well too. So it attracts less insects compared to white or like yellow light, which is really nice. So keep that in mind if you want to reduce that kind of activity. It also stresses out less of your nighttime pollinators, which is great, or daytime because they all get confused by that light at night. Puddling stations can usually be done in like a little terracotta dish or a bowl. Essentially, you put some soil down there, some rocks, you fill it with a little bit of water, and that is a great area for bees and butterflies to kind of get some water and also get some additional nutrition from those minerals that they may be missing as well too. Having areas of bare soil in your yard can be super helpful for any of those like mining bees or other bees that may kind of burrow into the ground to nest, which can be very nice. And then if you're a big planter or anything like that, oftentimes goodness, sorry about that. Oftentimes you'll have perennial flowers that are still kind of have the dead flower during that first winter, right? You can actually deadhead those and leave the stem 12 to 18 inches high, as this is like a really nice habitat for different type of pollinators in the spring, because again, they will just use the inside of that plant as a nesting area so that their young can hibernate over winter as well too, which is really interesting. So along with certifying your yard, you can also get in with the butterfly highway and become a pollinator pit stop. So this one focuses heavily on using native plants and supporting different aspects that will be beneficial to your pollinators. Butterfly Highway with the North Carolina Wildlife Federation has a great resource, has a nice garden toolkit to kind of help you get started. They tell you a lot of the different bloom times and different types of native plants that we have as well too. I highly recommend and stress native plants over ornamental plants, because native plants are those that have basically grown in this ecosystem for thousands of years, right? So they thrive in these ecosystems much better than a lot of ornamental plants may do, which mean they don't need as much water or as much fertilizer because they are made to work in this type of soil. Oftentimes, they also have deeper root systems, which can prevent rainwater runoff and maintain like a healthier soil, which is nice. And they're usually less prone to pest problems that require those chemical intervention as well too. When you're thinking about your different native plants, consider all levels of it, whether it's your trees, your shrubs, some of your small perennials. All of those can be beneficial, and all of those can be host plants, not just your perennials as well too, which is really cool. All of those will help, and you can also kind of have it in a way that has blooms across all seasons. So spring, summer, fall, and even those that create fruit in the wintertime can be great for not just your pollinators but also like your birds and stuff as well too. And having at least 3 species for each bloom time can be very helpful as well. Now, some of these are resources. Feel free to pause this slide later if you want to take a look at this, but these are some great options to look at if you're just getting started on figuring out how to create this kind of habitat in your yard as well too. The NC Pollinator Alliance has a lot of good resources. NC State has an Extension Gardener Handbook, which is absolutely delightful, and they have a lot of great resources from things like butterflies in your backyard, planting a wildlife habitat, landscaping for wildlife with native plants, and managing backyards and other urban habitats for birds. The North Carolina Wildlife Federation is the main guys that do the Butterfly Highway are certifying a habitat, and Wild Birds Unlimited is always down for certifying a habitat, but that Butterfly Highway can also provide resources and information. You can also get like a nice seed packet to kind of get started with them as well too. They have a native plant finder, which is great for finding out host plants in your local area. Wild Ones is a nonprofit as well too that kind of focuses on helping people getting started with native plants. They have chapters all throughout the U.S., so definitely feel free to check them out. And then the Xerxes Society for Invertebrate Conservation also has great starter information on habitat restoration and how to start your yard for that kind of native plant habitat as well too. These are other resources if you feel to check them out on your own. Definitely talks about a lot of the things that I talked about today. And if you find yourself coming into the store later today, or if you want to use a coupon, we have a $5 off a $25 coupon code or more. Just mention Pollinator. We'll take $5 off there. Available in store or through phone. And with that, I have gone a little bit over time. So thank you all very much for coming in. If you have any questions, feel free to leave a comment and I will check them on as we go. Thank you all. You guys have a good day. Bye.